In what is perhaps the biggest fight of the decade, we have Saul Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford, two pound-for-pound greats going toe-to-toe in an unlikely matchup. Everyone has an opinion, so who's going to win? Well, let's see if we can answer that question. Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford operate at very high levels, having both been the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world in recent history. They fight with very different styles than each other, with Canelo being a pressure fighter and Crawford being a slick mover, and both bring different, very effective abilities into this fight. However, there is so much more that goes into this fight than simply who's the better fighter or who has the stylistic advantage. For instance, perhaps the biggest topic of conversation is the size gap and the fact that Crawford is jumping up 2 weight divisions to fight the best 168-pound fighter in the world after having only one fight at 154 pounds. Other things to consider in this fight are their mental preparedness and, of course, how their skills and abilities stack up against each other, all of which I've done separate videos on. But here, we're putting it all together to find out who wins. Starting with the size debate, you have many people saying that Canelo is too big for Crawford since Crawford is having to jump 2 weight classes at once after having only one fight at 154. Meaning he's almost going straight from 147 to 168 with only one fight in between. The other side of the argument is that Canelo and Crawford are roughly the same height, with Crawford actually being half an inch taller than Canelo, and therefore there shouldn't really be any size advantage one way or the other. So, which side is right? Well, consider the fact that Crawford was fighting at 147 pounds at the peak of his career, having only had one fight at 154. And he never once appeared significantly drained or negatively affected by the weight cuts, meaning Crawford most likely belonged at 147. Also, take into account that Crawford, in his own words, said that the highest weight he could realistically fight at was 154.
What's the highest you could fight at realistically?
I would say 154 realistic.
154.
Them boys get big up there. Them boys get big. I think 154 will be my max. Given the age, I'm about to be 36 years old.
In addition to this information, we can also look at their frame and body structure and see why it is that Crawford spent his prime 3 weight classes below Canelo. Canelo clearly has a wider frame than Crawford, as well as bigger wrists and ankles. In short, this means that despite them being nearly even in height, Canelo's frame is simply built to effectively carry more weight and more muscle. Canelo's body is more suited to moving with more weight than Crawford's more narrow frame is. While Crawford is a good mover with fast hands, a lot of these advantages will likely see a noticeable drop in effectiveness after adding 14 pounds to his fighting weight in just 1 year. Most fighters also need at least one fight to truly adjust to a new weight class, and Crawford was clearly no exception based on his performance at 154. While Crawford still gave a great performance against Madrimov, he did not look as spectacular as he did in his fights at 147. Of course, there's always the chance that age played a factor in that as well. If that's the case, it's not like he's getting any younger. A year older and 14 pounds heavier in his late 30s is not exactly a recipe for success against the best fighter in a new weight class. That said, let's not ignore that Canelo has also noticeably declined in recent years. At the end of the day, while there's nothing stopping Crawford from putting on the weight for this fight, he's not used to fighting professionals at 168, and he clearly needed an adjustment period for 154. So that need for adjustment is that much greater when jumping up 14 pounds at once after already jumping up 7 more pounds for his previous fight. And based on his frame and fighting history, his body will not be as effective at 168 as it was at 147 and 154. And based on his body structure, it's doubtful that Crawford will handle Canelo's punches as well as most fighters at 168. And considering that Canelo has a tendency to target his opponent's arms and shoulders in addition to scoring clean shots, which he has some of the best accuracy in the sport with, Crawford stands a good chance of getting hurt even from the shots that are blocked. And whatever speed and mobility advantage Crawford may have had in this fight will at least be greatly reduced, if not completely nullified. Taking all of this into account, I give the final verdict that Canelo will absolutely have the size advantage in the ring simply because he's in a weight class he's very used to, and for perhaps the first time in years, he's fighting a smaller opponent than himself, and one who, in his own words, does not belong at 168. But size obviously does not tell the whole story. In any fight, it's important for fighters to be confident and mentally prepared. In many cases, the mental aspect alone can be the difference between a comfortable victory or a disappointing outcome. So, does one fighter look more prepared or more confident than the other? Well, let's look at their press conferences leading up to the fight. In these press conferences and face-offs, Canelo looks the way Canelo always has. Calm, confident, unbothered, sometimes appearing almost bored. And none of this looks feigned or acted. He genuinely looks relaxed. The only chink I've seen in his armor is the face-off where he was walked down and he pushed Crawford with what appeared to be a hesitant amount of force. Even here, Canelo looked unbothered, and while I can't read his mind, I chalk most of Canelo's reaction up to surprise. I believe Canelo was surprised that Crawford acted out in the way that he did, and for good reason. In the lead up to this fight, particularly during that heated exchange, Crawford has acted out of character, at least compared with his showings in the lead ups to previous fights.
Not taking, any credit away from Errol, he's a great fighter. He's good at what he do.
Acting out of character is, in many cases, a sign that someone is threatened or at least in a heightened emotional state. In other words, Crawford's probably uncomfortable. And that face-off was not the only instance of him acting out. In multiple press conferences, Crawford has been seen exhibiting more aggressive trash talk than we normally see from him. And in some cases, he doesn't appear to look all that convinced of what he's saying, at least based on his facial expressions and his defensive body language. And as stated before, Crawford himself admitted that fighting above 154 was unrealistic. So I'm having a hard time being convinced of his tough talk now when he's already admitted out loud that he has no business fighting in this weight class. It's very possible that Canelo himself is not directly the cause of Crawford's apparent nervousness, but rather it's the size of the event. Crawford's been in big events before, but he's never been part of anything of this magnitude. And to top it off, he's not exactly the A-side here. Canelo, on the other hand, has been in at least one fight bigger than this when he fought Floyd Mayweather Jr. in 2013. Canelo's been in a bigger spotlight than this, even as a 23-year-old kid. By comparison, this probably feels pretty comfortable, since this time he's the A-side, and he's up against a fighter who, if we're being real, is no Floyd Mayweather. No disrespect to Crawford, He is an excellent fighter, and as I'll cover momentarily, I would argue that he's a more technically skilled fighter than the current version of Canelo. While both fighters are generally mentally tough and very confident, and for good reason, Crawford appears to be out of his element, and he appears to be going to great lengths to prove otherwise. But the fact that he's trying so hard to prove he's not scared has, in my opinion, given him away. It's very understandable and reasonable that the magnitude of this event might have him feeling nervous. It's only natural, but that doesn't erase the effects his mindset could have on his performance and the overall outcome of the fight. So my final verdict here is that Canelo is the more mentally dominant and mentally prepared fighter. Canelo and Crawford are both among the most skilled fighters in the game today, even though there has been some decline on both ends, with Canelo's decline being more noticeable despite his younger age. Despite all that, who is the better fighter here? Offensively, Crawford has a deeper bag of tools than Canelo. Canelo is a flat-footed pressure fighter whose general style is fairly predictable. In any fight at 168, we pretty much know what we're going to get from him. He's going to start at a fairly slow pace, gauging his opponent for 1 or 2 rounds before walking down his opponent and beginning a series of fairly predictable patterns of single hooks, 1-2 punches, and his signature multiple jabs before a power punch. And his volume won't be especially high while doing this. But despite his simple and predictable pattern, he has one of the highest connect percentages in the game. His accuracy is in part due to his exceptional timing and shot selection. However, he also sets his shots up very well with feints and jabs. His distance management is also at a very high level, though I would argue that Crawford's distance management is generally even better. Canelo tends not to waste his movements on shots that don't have a high chance of landing, but because of this, he has to make his punches count, and his power to do so is quite considerable, though it should be noted that he's failed to knock out his last 7 opponents, some of whom he really shouldn't have had a problem knocking out. That said, Canelo has managed to at least knock down 4 out of his last 5 opponents, with the exception of William Skull, for obvious reasons, just to keep it polite. And to be fair, it should also be noted that all of these guys were bigger than Canelo, with the possible exception of Charlo, who had no business fighting at 168, seeing as how he'd spent most of his career fighting at 154 before jumping up 2 weight classes to fight Canelo. Sound familiar? Still, despite Canelo's considerable skill, with his current fighting style, it would mean little without his power. If his opponents weren't afraid of his power, I don't see him being as successful at 168, considering he's one of the smaller fighters in that division as well. Essentially, Canelo's power is what saves him in his fights. When his power isn't effective enough against an opponent, well, we see what happens. Though, to be fair, his power has only been rendered less effective by arguably the best fighter of this generation and arguably the best light heavyweight fighter of this generation. Crawford is not on Floyd Mayweather's level, especially in a defensive manner that could nullify Canelo's power. And Crawford certainly isn't anywhere near big enough to tank Canelo's punches the way Dimitri Bivol did. Even so, how does Crawford's overall skill level measure up next to Canelo's? In contrast to Canelo's pressure style, Crawford is more of a boxer who moves around the ring, not to be confused with running. Aside from being a boxer puncher and prolific counterpuncher, it's hard to really pin down Crawford's style because he is perhaps the best in the game at making adjustments, so much so that he can almost completely alter his style mid-fight and use a completely new style as if it was his plan A all along. Crawford is an incredibly dynamic fighter with an extremely good jab, which seems to be the punch that Canelo is the most susceptible to. Crawford's movement is also nowhere near as straightforward as Canelo's forward-moving style. Crawford is very good at using the space around him to his advantage, being able to attack from crazy angles and even evade with crazy angles. Crawford's style is not as predictable or straightforward as Canelo's, and his accuracy is just as good as Canelo's, if not possibly better, despite the disparity in the CompuBox numbers. I think the reason Crawford's accuracy numbers don't usually measure up to Canelo's, with the exception of the Errol Spence fight, is because Crawford uses more punches, especially the jab, when setting up his shots. Crawford uses a lot of throwaway shots to set up the shots that he means to do damage, and when it comes to those intentional shots, Crawford is at least as accurate as Canelo. That said, the one area Crawford seems to fall short compared to Canelo is his defense. Crawford simply gets hit more than Canelo, and Crawford's defense, while not necessarily lacking, simply does not stand out next to the rest of the world-level competition, whereas Canelo's defense stands out as exceptional even among the same level of competition. Looking at their overall styles and abilities, my verdict in the skill department is that Crawford appears to be the better of the two fighters at the moment, while also having somewhat of a stylistic advantage due to Canelo's apparent weakness against good jabbers. And Crawford has a solid reach advantage that he's not afraid to use. But this is Crawford at 147 and 154, not 168. And he was up against fighters who are most certainly not Canelo. So taking all of this into account, who wins? Crawford appears to be the higher level fighter, but not by an extraordinarily high margin. Still, if this fight were happening at 147 or 154, with both of them fighting the way they normally have for the past few years, I would have this fight comfortably for Crawford. But this fight is happening at 168, and that changes a lot. Nothing Crawford does in a training camp can possibly replicate the experience of fighting a fellow pound-for-pound great in a real fight at a weight class he's never come close to experiencing. Now, this doesn't mean that Crawford will suddenly start moving like cold molasses going up a hill in the wintertime just because he added 14 pounds to his fighting weight in a year. However, it does mean that there will absolutely be a noticeable difference in the speed and quality of Crawford's punches and movements. While I don't expect Crawford to suddenly move slower than Canelo typically does in the ring, I do expect Crawford to move slower than normal, and I do also expect that movement will slow down further in the later rounds as his stamina will inevitably be sapped by the additional weight that his frame already isn't as effective in carrying. While Crawford's reflexes might not slow down drastically as a result of the past year of aging, his reaction times will most certainly be slowed by the additional weight. And, as evidenced by his apparent mental state in his press conferences, interviews, and his own admissions, the weight of his doubts might slow him down just as much as the weight of his body. If Crawford were leagues ahead of Canelo in terms of skill and ability, I'd give Crawford a fighting chance. If Crawford were fighting the likes of, say, John Ryder, for example, I'd have the fight for Crawford even at the 2, arguably 3 weight class jump. No disrespect to John Ryder, but Terence Crawford's skill is arguably leagues above Ryder. This is not the case when comparing Crawford's skill to Canelo's. While I see Crawford as the better boxer, he is not leagues above Canelo by any stretch of the imagination. So these other factors, like size and mental state, will have an immense impact on the outcome of this fight. So now, let's put them in the ring. This is how I see this fight going. From the opening bell, both fighters will start out slow and calculated, as both fighters typically do, regardless of their opponent. Both fighters want to gauge their opponent, but neither fighter wants to make an embarrassing mistake early on. Canelo doesn't want to get outboxed and caught with counters too early, and Crawford doesn't want to catch Canelo's power too early. Still, both fighters are under pressure to perform here. The first 2 rounds will almost certainly be relatively boring, with Crawford typically throwing more volume than Canelo typically does. While I don't anticipate either fighter landing anything of serious consequence this early on, Crawford tends to throw more volume than Canelo on average, and the early rounds are no exception. So while Crawford may come in with some nervous energy, I expect Crawford to throw more punches and therefore land more punches while moving better, even if he's getting pushed back. So I see Terence Crawford winning the first couple rounds, but Canelo will hardly be deterred by Crawford's efforts. After this point, I see both fighters getting more comfortable with each other. Canelo will more or less know what kind of power and movement to expect from Crawford, and Crawford will likely start to get comfortable after feeling like he's got an early lead. From here, I expect both fighters to open up more, with Canelo applying more pressure. If Crawford hasn't felt the peak of Canelo's power here, he will soon. Over the course of the next couple rounds, I expect to see Crawford take some hits and start to make adjustments. These next couple rounds will likely go either way, but I expect Canelo to start gaining momentum. Even if these rounds are competitive, I believe that by the end of the 4th round, Crawford will start to understand what he's really up against. And while I think Crawford can hang in there, I think he'll start to understand that his stamina might not hold up against his own weight, combined with the pressure Canelo is applying and the damage Canelo's dealing, whether it's from clean shots or block shots. Crawford will still be able to put on quite the show at this point, but I think even he will start to feel the clock counting down to the time when he starts to give out. From here, the fight could go one of 3 ways. Crawford will either choose to pace himself in an effort to make sure he goes the distance and doesn't get knocked out or knocked down. Or he'll understand that his stamina is only dropping from here and he'll choose to go all in a knockout attempt. Or he'll keep up just high enough of a pace to try to outbox Canelo for as many rounds as possible and try to win a total of maybe 9 or 10 rounds before he can't keep that pace anymore and goes completely on the defensive for the remaining rounds, which, of course, all depends on his ability to successfully outbox Canelo for an extended period of time. Crawford, being the extremely intelligent fighter that he is, I personally believe that the latter option of trying to outbox Canelo for as long as possible is probably going to be his choice. But during Crawford's attempt to do this, he's going to get hit. He's going to take some clean shots, and he's going to get hit by some of Canelo's signature arm and shoulder attacks meant to slow down his opponent's offense and deal some additional damage. Even Williams' skull couldn't avoid the shots with all of his running, just barely getting outlanded by Canelo while throwing nearly double the punches Canelo did. And I don't anticipate Crawford to run like Skull did. No disrespect to Skull. Even if Crawford manages to outbox Canelo, I believe that Crawford will still be taking more damage than Canelo. And after the mid-fight, I believe the most likely scenario is that Crawford's offense starts to slow down, if only slightly, due to Canelo's arm and shoulder attacks. The added weight will probably start to further sap Crawford's stamina. The pressure will start to wear Crawford down physically and possibly mentally, though I don't expect Crawford to mentally crumble too easily, even in this situation. Still, at least in the later rounds, I think mental fatigue is a fairly decent possibility for Crawford. While I'm not necessarily expecting a knockout due to Canelo's inability to knock out previous opponents that I believe he should have been able to knock out, a knockout against Crawford is a reasonable possibility. After all, Crawford is the smallest opponent Canelo will have fought in a long time, and Crawford will be completely out of his weight element, even more so than Jermell Charlo was against Canelo. At the end of the day, no matter how Crawford chooses to approach this fight, assuming Canelo's not having an off night, and assuming Canelo hasn't horribly declined further in the last year, I see Canelo winning. If Crawford chooses to pace himself, Canelo will apply pressure and win by being the more aggressive fighter who's doing more damage. If Crawford chooses to outbox him for a significant enough portion of the fight, he risks draining his stamina and getting knocked out in the later rounds. If Crawford chooses to go for the knockout, which there is supposedly a bonus for, then he's at the highest risk of getting knocked out himself. I believe Crawford's best chance at victory is to simply outbox Canelo while putting very little power in his shots in order to retain as much stamina as possible. He'll still have to fight a near perfect fight in order to pull this off, because let's face it, the judges aren't taking the undisputed status away from the face of boxing unless Crawford really earns it. So narrowly winning 7 rounds simply won't cut it with the judges here. Crawford has to put on a dominant performance for a significant majority of the fight in order to secure a victory. I think Crawford can do it, but I don't think that he will do it. Not just because of the weight gain, but because of the weight of the mental pressure of the event as well. I think these two factors combined will drain Crawford's ability and stamina, causing what almost seems to be an inevitable loss. So my official prediction and my bet as of right now is for Canelo Alvarez to win the fight. However, I'm not touching whether or not he wins by knockout. I think that's a 50-50 possibility, and honestly, it's not worth the bet to me. However, if you're looking for a higher payout, do so at your own risk, because as always, this is for entertainment purposes only. This is not financial advice. Anyway, guys, as always, my final prediction will come after the weigh-in, which should be an interesting one for sure. So until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next one.